I keep saying there's nothing sexier than integrity. There's nothing more powerful than that. And you look at, and you don't need characters to be deeply flawed or broken to be interesting. And if they're deeply flawed and broken, can we have them on a redemptive healing journey? Yeah. But I look at Captain America, the Winter Soldier, look at that film. You have, just like Chris Reeve's Superman, you have this really moral, honest, kind character of integrity in a really messed up world. Bruce Wayne in the Dark Knight trilogy is the same way, right? And that is fascinating and that's compelling, and we need more examples of that.
The story is people often write or create art for therapy, but how often are we consuming art for therapeutic purposes? And is it effective? How often are we unintentionally consuming messages for better or worse that alter our perspectives, therefore our experience? Today we discuss the realities and possibilities of cinema as therapy. I'm Joel Ackerman, joined by Stephanie Casperson in the booth, and this is Lightwise. Jonathan Decker is a licensed therapist. His friend and associate Alan Seawright is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. Together they make up a dynamic duo that analyzes films from a psychological perspective, claiming to make sense of life one blockbuster at a time, with their YouTube channel called Cinema Therapy. Alan, Jonathan,
Joel.
Welcome. So is that how you describe what you do from a psychological perspective? Or how do you describe, to people who haven't seen your channel, Cinema Therapy, how do you describe what you do and the way you analyze movies?
I've always described it as it's Siskel and Ebert meets Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you're...
I've seen your show and I'm going, okay, but keep going.
You've been skipping the part where we change our shoes and put on sweaters. That's fine.
The idea is how do you share actual research-based psychological information on healthy relationships, on coping with trauma, on mental health and emotional wellness? How do you share that in a way that is fun and digestible but still accurate? Yep. And so the idea was never to make, one of our fans described it as, it's not pop psychology, it's actual psychology with a flavoring of pop culture.
With a pop culture lens.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's almost reverse. You came at it wanting to communicate the psychology, and you're using the cinema as the medicine to help the sugar to help the medicine go down.
Exactly.
Okay, right on. What I want to talk about today is a little bit different, a little twist on that, but is the idea of using cinema as therapy, right?
Sure.
And the potential that it has to help us with our mental health, our coping, et cetera. Obviously, I've heard of and even done a little bit of art therapy.
Sure.
Okay. There's music therapy, there's equine therapy. I'm wondering, is film therapy a thing? And if not, should it be?
It is. I'm certified.
Cool.
Before we started the show,
long before.
Yeah, I went online and got certified in cinema therapy, and at least at that time, it was seen as supplemental. It was not a specific approach in and of itself. So if you're a therapist, you could use cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, different styles, and the cinema was meant to supplement and bolster that. And the idea is always, okay, what does this look like in application? Or what does this not look like in application, to take something abstract and make it more concrete? And we say this on the show. In real life, what we're seeing here on film, this is actually a pretty accurate representation, but they have to do it in 2 hours. In real life, it's going to take 2 or 3 years. It's going to take 2 or 3 months, but yeah.
And what does it look like? I mean, how do you select the films? Are they watching the full films? Are they watching the films with you in the office? Is it something you go home, watch it, and then we come, like, what does it look like?
Is it take 2 Pixars and call me in the morning?
Yeah.
I could be so wealthy if I just did that.
Right?
I don't know why I'm even slumming it with you. My gosh.
Seriously.
It varies. For some therapists, it looks like we've got a TV in the office, we're going to watch a clip and we're going to discuss it together, and we'll pull it up on YouTube. For a lot of therapists, it's, here's my recommendation, and this is the film I want you to watch. And it's always, here's what I want you to be looking for. Here's the questions I want you to search for answers to while you're watching.
Okay. And yeah, how often is it that you have to kind of tell them, this is what you should be getting from this clip? And how, or do you fully expect them to draw the meaning for themselves?
Well, and Alan talks about, at the top of every show, this is something that Alan came up with, is I'm Jonathan Decker, I'm a licensed therapist who loves movies, and
I'm Alan Seawright, I'm a professional filmmaker who needs therapy.
and just like any other good therapy, because I'm kind of the clinical end and Alan is the experience end of, Alan can tell you what it feels like to be in therapy and to go through it. I've done a little bit, I should probably do more, but I've done a little bit on the couch, but I do most of it in the chair. And good therapy is about letting people find their own conclusions.
Yeah.
And good art is like that too.
It absolutely is. And that the approach, I think, that you generally take with your clients in cinema therapy is, giving them a prescription. Here's a film to watch, here's a character to study, here's what to look for and think about, but draw your own conclusions. And then next session, we're going to discuss it and we're going to talk about what you learned, how you can apply it to yourself, that kind of thing. So it's guided, but self-actualized. That sounds sounds like I went to school.
Yeah, and you did.
I did. Not for
the glasses
therapy.
prove it. Look
Hey.
Well, and that's, I have had times where I'm like, well, okay, this is what I want them to get out of it. So I'm sure they're going to come back and say, this was my takeaway and we're right in sync. And that happens, but I'm very often surprised that they zig when I thought they were going to zag. And sometimes their zig is far more powerful than my zag. I said, oh, what you took from it is far better than what I was thinking you would get from it. And then
that's when you do the, yes, exactly.
Yes, that's exactly what I wanted you to go for. And then other times it's kind of like, okay, let's combine what you took from it and what I was hoping you'd see, and let's combine that and merge that together. Same as if you do any other homework or reading that you give people.
Yeah.
So what's the line between using this as using film or TV? I assume you also sometimes recommend TV stuff. Between using that as a like an escape, right?
Yeah.
And in other words, what are the conditions that are necessary? And maybe you can speak to this, Alan. What are the conditions that are necessary to change your viewing experience? Is it just a little bit of mindfulness, or like to change your consumption of media from escapism or entertainment to therapy?
I mean, speaking personally, it is sometimes mindfulness, unlocks little nuggets of information and little tidbits of, self-improvement. But generally speaking, crisis unlocks change.
So just having the issue.
Just having a major crisis, you'll suddenly start to find all kinds of meaning all over the place.
Yeah.
Particularly if a professional is like, hey, here's a way to, unlock maybe some hope and some meaning for you. You can find things where you wouldn't expect to.
As a film buff, because I'm not in the industry, but I really do love movies. I'm just crazy about them. I think it's the highest art form, as long as you're dealing with film and not content, because Alan hates that word.
Hate the word content.
As long as you're dealing with actual film, because if you think about it, think of all the other forms of art, from sculpture to painting to architecture to wardrobe or fashion design to acting and performance to choreography
Music.
to martial arts to music. It's all there in film. It's all combined.
Yep.
And so I think there's such a way, you talk about enjoying entertainment, enjoying a movie, and that's true. You can also enjoy it with your brain turned on, and suddenly there's multiple levels going on, which is why for ADHD folks, it's a perfect medium to enjoy, because there's so many things for the brain to connect with.
Triggering everything all at once.
And when it comes to actually viewing mindfully, I think if you're just open to, I'm going on an emotional journey and I'm experiencing by proxy what the character is going through, I think it happens naturally. I think this is why we love good stories. I mean, I don't think people needed a YouTube channel or a therapeutic approach called cinema therapy for them to take meaning from stories that helps them in their lives.
Yeah.
All we're doing is really accentuating it and opening up things that maybe people hadn't considered. But people do this naturally with stories that they encounter. That's what makes stories so powerful.
This is what I've been doing my entire life. The reason I work in film is because movies always spoke to me on such a deep emotional gut level. And I mean, storytelling in general, I love reading novels. I love playing video games. There's a lot to be said for that. But movies have been such a huge part of my subconscious for my entire life that when Jonathan proposed to me, like, hey, let's actually use these therapeutic concepts and help lots of people, it immediately was just like it was just yes, because
You got it immediately.
I got it immediately, and I knew that if I got it, I wouldn't be the only one.
Right.
So,
Okay, Steph, you have a question.
Yeah. So
Hi, Steph.
Hi. In light of all of that, I'm really curious how you put together your content. Do you sit down together and say, this is what we feel like the world needs right now? Or does it start from, like what movies impact you, personally? I mean, because you have the platform to take something that's come out that is impactful and say, I think this message will resonate at this moment. Have you done that?
Well, Steph, can I call you Steph? Sorry.
Yes, please.
What the world needs now is love.
Right.
Sweet love.
Sweet
Amen.
The short version of that is we very much, there's a two-pronged approach. We either look at what is something that we've been thinking about a lot lately, therapeutically, that we really want to get across, and what's a good movie that has broad appeal that's going to reach a lot of people where we can talk about that. And then the other approach is a movie first approach where it's like, hey, there's a new DreamWorks movie coming out. DreamWorks movies are big hits. What can we pull from that, and how can we help people, from this specific film? And that's really 99% of our shows are one of those two things. We're looking for a therapeutic concept, or where we know we have a movie that we're going to need to talk about, and what can we pull out of that?
How much of therapy, not just, obviously film is storytelling, but how much of therapy is storytelling, stories we tell ourselves, is story construction, narrative construction?
It's funny you should bring that up, and Alan's heard me say this a lot. There's a lot of modalities. One that I'm really drawn to, but then I'm a story person, is called narrative therapy. And narrative therapy is literally about crafting the story of what your life is. And what's fun about narrative therapy and empowering about narrative therapy is, okay, here's the predetermined things. These are the facts. By predetermined, I mean they've already happened, so post-determined. These are the facts of your life. Those don't change. But what's going to free you up to heal is changing the meaning.
Yeah.
Right? That if I've encountered a trauma, if I've encountered abuse, that if I'm in a lane where I'm a victim, of rewriting the narrative so I'm a survivor, and then from survivor to advocate, and from advocate to thriver. The facts don't change. I'm a victim of abuse, right? I endured abuse, but I have taken myself on this hero's journey, if you will, and it's not wish fulfillment, and it's not just talking myself into nice things. It's actually empowering myself to flip the script and reframe things to a powerful place.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, this is the style of therapy that was most effective for me. I did some cognitive behavioral, and that was fine, and I did some other things, and then I started meeting with a therapist that, without explicitly saying we're going to do narrative therapy, just started recontextualizing all the stories I was telling, and that worked because I got to tell a new story about myself.
Yeah, it sounds really powerful. Just in case we have listeners who've had that experience, can you name, just off the top of your head, some films, some films or TV shows that would help a person go on that journey? We don't have to get into the specifics of how, but
yeah. Well, and I think we can both name some.
Yeah.
We did a Good Will Hunting episode that's very powerful. The whole "it's not your fault" scene is what's called in therapy a reframe.
Yep.
Okay.
Right? That Matt Damon's character was abused, but the reframe is it's not your fault, and you've been cognitively saying it's not my fault, but emotionally you believed your whole life that it is.
Yes.
And actually letting go of that and letting your abuser own that is healing, right? So Good Will Hunting is an example. Anything else?
If you look at the story of Loki across the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, he goes from his journey is one of retelling his own story a whole bunch of times, and he finally settles on a story where he gets to be a hero, and then he gets killed.
You're in a movie-making studio.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to be making, gentlemen? What messages are not being made that need to be made for individuals and the mental health of society at large?
First of all, I want to thank anyone involved with Angel Studios. I'm looking at Cameron now. That was awkward. First of all, I want to thank everyone involved at Angel Studios, because I love the idea of faith-focused films. I haven't loved the execution.
Generally, yep.
And Angel, with The Chosen, with His Only Son, with things that I've seen, there's an emphasis on here's what a good story told looks like.
Yes.
And
It's a good story. It happens to have faith in it.
yeah. And so first of all, so hats off to all of you. Second of all, there's a trend towards the bias has always been that healthy relationships are boring. And we're seeing more and more media that's being put out that's saying otherwise. One of our favorite examples, maybe a little salty for your audience, but Ted Lasso. is a great example of people modeling emotional maturity. Not at every single moment, but they always get there and they grow there.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes that specific example so powerful is because people grow and get to a place, that's what we're all doing too.
Yeah.
None of us are perfect models of emotional maturity all the time, except Jonathan. Because there is so much media, I think audiences are getting a lot more savvy and they're starting to sniff out the easy story tropes.
Right.
Yeah.
And because the easy stuff has been mined, the more difficult stuff is the more nuanced stuff.
Yeah.
And that tends to lead to, in a satisfying way, it leads to more, emotionally mature outcomes. Obviously, in a bad way, it can also lead to Breaking Bad.
Yeah. Well, and here, I like Breaking Bad, though. And the reason I like Breaking Bad is it doesn't glamorize.
No.
It is very much a morality tale and a tragedy. And I think, speaking of what needs to be seen, is healthy portrayed as healthy and unhealthy portrayed as unhealthy. I've watched a lot of romantic comedies where a very toxic, unhealthy person is attractive and they change miraculously by the love of a good woman by the end of the movie. Whereas a very decent person who treats her right is boring and bland and vanilla. And I keep saying there's nothing sexier than integrity. There's nothing more powerful than that. And you look at, and you don't need characters to be deeply flawed or broken to be interesting. And if they're deeply flawed and broken, can we have them on a redemptive healing journey? Yeah. But I look at Captain America, the Winter Soldier, look at that film. You have, just like Chris Reeve's Superman, you have this really moral, honest, kind character of integrity in a really messed up world. Bruce Wayne in the Dark Knight trilogy is the same way, right? And that is fascinating and that's compelling, and we need more examples of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so especially since you brought up superhero movies, I've wanted to kind of ask you about this. So I'm wondering if this means this perspective that you have of viewing films and kind of analyzing, okay, are these healthy relationships? Is this, toxic, not toxic? I'm wondering if it's the only way, or if there's another viable way to watch films. And let me just give one example from one of your.
This is it.
This is the way, Joel.
One of the popular videos that you guys have ranked the relationships. You took several Disney relationships, right?
Yeah.
And you ranked them from worst to best. Okay, and I think the worst or second worst was Snow White.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and her relationship with the prince. And I didn't disagree with your analysis through that lens, right?
Right.
So, but interestingly enough, I also recently watched an interview with Jordan Peterson, another therapist, who's very interested in art and cinema. And his analysis of Snow White was different in that it was a fairy tale and therefore archetypal and more like a parable. He was analyzing from a parable standpoint. So he wasn't looking at it as like, oh, this is an actual relationship. This is a stand-in for something, and it means something, it's bigger or different. It's not supposed to represent an actual, this is the way the relationship was, but it's a placeholder for saying there's this love story going on.
Yeah.
I do think fewer people actually look at movies that way. They don't look at it symbolically.
I don't know that a lot of people are like reading their Jung and then walking into the movie theater.
Exactly.
But
is it a viable way? And can you put on different hats and say, I'm going to look at this movie through this lens, and now I'm going to look at it through a different lens? Or what do you think? Is it so implicit into the movie that it's going to affect us whether we want it to or not in a negative way if that negative relationship is there?
I have thoughts, but I want to hear yours if you...
Yeah, listen, art belongs, like once the artist hands it off, it belongs to the audience, right? And so any read that any individual person takes from watching a film is a valid read because that was their experience of watching the movie, and their experience is what's important.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure there are tons of people who have watched Snow White, which is a textbook horrible relationship, and they've watched it and drawn lessons that have improved their interpersonal relationships. And maybe, like in our case, we were looking at the negatives and like, don't do this. And I'm sure there are lots of people who watched it and, maybe cognitively and maybe not, got that archetypal thing and were seeing, okay, this is how this can apply to my life, and it made a positive change in their life. I know Snow White is a favorite movie for millions of people. It's a beautiful film, and tells a fun story. And there's dwarves. Who doesn't love singing dwarves?
I do.
Exactly.
Joel does.
So
he really does.
He really
He's
does.
known for that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that
That's
is
one of
his
his
thing.
You see me after.
So, I'm not going to just blanket disagree. I think that, the beauty of art is that it's open to interpretation.
Yeah. And my quick piggyback off of that is there's two extreme reactions to film and art that I strongly disagree with. One is we have to extremely limit anything we consume because it affects us so deeply and it will cause us to change and act out in terrible ways. And the other is it doesn't affect us at all.
Yep.
Obviously it affects us. That's why
we're going.
That's why we're going, and that's why filmmakers get paid by products for product placement because what we watch affects us. But the fact is, you just need to watch with your brain turned on.
Yeah.
I love healthy relationships. I also love James Bond. Those don't really go together. And I remember watching James Bond as a teenager with my dad. And I'm a teenage boy, and my hormones are raging, and I'm seeing all these beautiful women, and I'm thinking James Bond is super cool. And my dad said one thing. He just said, as long as James keeps sleeping around, he's never going to be as happy as I am with your mom. That's it. And it completely snapped James Bond into oh, yeah, he is
What a sad boy.
I'm like, but he can outrun machine gun fire, right?
Sure,
this isn't reality. And so when I watch James Bond, I'm like, this is an escape, and it's fine to enjoy it as an escape. And we poo-pooed all over Twilight, but we also said, look, if you love Twilight, enjoy it as your junk food entertainment, but don't model your relationships after it.
Yeah.
And so you absolutely can. All you need to do is just be critically thinking, even just a little bit, just
a
Right,
tiny bit.
mindful.
yeah.
I like that.
So how do you? What's the responsibility of the filmmaker or maybe even of the parent? How do you encourage that intentionality, when it comes to consuming media of any kind, but of something like we've been talking about, how impactful the messages of movies can be, and you mentioned watching James Bond with your dad, and he just took that moment to shift your perspective. Do we need to do that? If we don't do that, is there a place for that protectionism of this film, you shouldn't go there? That sort of thing.
Sure. If as parents you don't have the time to necessarily police every single thing and sit and watch every single thing with your kids, common sense media, the British rating system, the American rating system, if you have to fall back on something, you can rely on those things at least a little bit. But and to your question about how responsible should filmmakers be to that, I don't know that I would want to limit filmmakers in the stories they want to tell.
Sure.
And that includes, depicting truly horrifying things, because sometimes you can depict a truly horrifying thing that changes a character and leads them to growth, or changes a character and leads them to their own destruction, but you can learn from that.
Yeah.
The Wolf of Wall Street is not a play-by-play manual for how to live your life. It is a fascinating look at a guy absolutely destroying everything around him. And that's what it's meant to be. I don't think Martin Scorsese has to be out there saying over and over and over again, don't model yourself on this guy. He put it on the screen.
Yeah, portraying something isn't condoning it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I don't know that filmmakers necessarily have to limit what they're doing. I would appreciate in the marketing of films maybe a little bit more discussion of, what is the filmmaker's intent here?
Yeah.
What are the things that we're trying to learn here? And obviously, in the marketing, who is this for? Who's going to benefit?
Yeah.
Well,
and I with my kids, they say, Dad, can I watch, let's say Back to the Future, right? Language, sexual themes, classic film, lots of uplifting, wonderful themes. Dad, can I watch Back to the Future? You can watch it with me.
Yep.
Right. There are certain films that my kids have free reign on. There are other films that I'm like, if you choose to watch Pulp Fiction when you're 17, knock yourself out. I'm not super going for Pulp Fiction here in our house when you're a minor. It's not happening. I'm sorry. And then other films, I'm like, yeah, you can watch that, but you're going to watch it with me because we're going to talk about things. And to the point of your question, there are movies that I watch that don't necessarily share my values one-to-one per se.
Sure.
But I watch them with my kids and we talk about, okay, how did this choice affect the character? Or how did this choice affect the character in the film? And what do you think would happen in real life if they made that choice, right?
Yeah.
And it's also an opportunity to understand the viewpoints of people who believe differently or see the world differently. And so I don't think we need to shield children from everything. I think we need to give them context. I know of families where their kids can watch bloody horror movies, but then afterwards they watch the making of, and they see a bunch of people on crew goofing around with corn syrup. And
this is my kid.
Yeah.
I have one child who is obsessed with making of processes, and like his favorite thing is The Thing, which is
movie.
horrifying, right? Absolutely gross. But he's just obsessed with the mechanical, like how did they design the monsters? How did they pump all the goo and the blood? Like how did they make this happen?
So just a side question, because I'm totally curious. I grew up with a mother who didn't watch movies with us very often, but when she did, it always seemed like she was ruining it by like, did you see that? Did you see how whatever?
Yeah.
Are your kids excited when you say you can watch that with me, or are they like, Dad?
we don't talk about it during.
Okay.
I very much respect the
experience.
but we're going to talk about it after.
We're both movie theater shushers. We will shush people.
Yeah.
We will shush our own children in our basements.
But you go out for ice cream after going to a movie that
Yeah,
there's
and
stuff to
then
talk
you-
about,
yeah.
and it's a bonding experience, and it also teaches them critical thinking and to explore their own morality, and that's powerful.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because you mentioned a lot of movies, Wolf of Wall Street, Back to the Future. It's interesting because my guess is, this is just a guess, I don't know the filmmakers personally, but my guess is Martin Scorsese, knowing a little bit about Martin Scorsese, he probably was intentional in saying this is kind of a cautionary tale. This is, I want to show a
very much
person
so, yeah.
destructing. Whereas in the case of Back to the Future, I'm just using those examples because they're what you used. My guess is that wasn't intentional. They were just trying to tell a fun movie, and it's
Yeah.
up to the parents to kind of say, hey, do you see what's going on here? The bad stuff that's going on here that you shouldn't learn from. So it does sound, for the most part, some filmmakers might put it into the movie, or at least it becomes evident in the movie making that what you should be taking from it. But some, it's totally our responsibility to draw from it what we will. Would you agree with that?
I mean, ultimately, it's the audience's responsibility. The audience is responsible for what they consume and how they consume it. I, as a filmmaker, cannot dictate to an audience,
Right.
this is, I do my best. This is what you're going to feel right now.
Right.
That's my job. But everybody's different, right? People are going to have different reactions to different
And I
scenes.
think personally, I think that's good. I'm curious, you, Alan, you're a filmmaker. I'm wondering if you feel like there's too much concern for the message by filmmakers, or if you had to say one way or the other, and obviously every film's different, but if you had to say one way or the other, do you feel like filmmakers right now are too concerned for the messaging, or not enough concerned for what's being communicated by the film?
My opinion, I think by and large, studio heads are more concerned with content than messaging. I think most people who make films,
content as it affects bottom line,
as-
generally.
Okay.
people who make films, directors, and especially writers are, especially if they're doing something from the heart, they're trying to convey something, right? And this is why, sometimes we talk about on the show, there's a difference between Disney corporate and Disney creative, because people can talk about the decisions of Disney corporate all they want, but I look at some of the films we've reviewed over the past few years, particularly like Coco comes to mind, right? And I think of the sheer beautiful power of the message of that film, and that was very deliberate. That was somebody who was trying to share something that uplifts and builds hope and encourages connection, right? And so to answer your question, I don't think there is a too much or too little. I think it's case by case. I would just love to see a renaissance where creatives are set loose, and then the market determines, okay, this is what we're interested in.
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons why I ask is because as I work at Angel Studios, I read a lot of scripts, and I frequently feel that the story completely suffers from too much thought about message.
Too much message.
So they don't think about story.
And that's
and my argument is, and I think what you've said about how we glean from films anyway would support this idea, which is the idea that whatever story you tell, it's going to have message. It's going to have lessons, whether you try and insert it or not.
Yeah.
And in some way, just by telling a great story, that will happen naturally. And you don't have to shoehorn in, well, this is what I hope the audience takes from it.
Yeah.
And this is a particular problem that I find in faith-based film. There's a lot of slapping people in the face with the message, when if you tell a good story, you can get that same message across without hitting people in the face with it. And there's nothing wrong with being fairly direct about messaging. And there are plenty of faith-based films that do a really good job of that. What's the Joseph Fiennes one where he's the centurion?
Risen.
Risen.
Did you finally watch that?
I did.
It's good, huh?
It's really, really good. And it's, it's pretty in your face about like, hey, Jesus is the savior and he came back and he rose from the grave. And I mean, it literally knocks a guy over on camera. Couldn't get more obvious than that.
Right.
But, as in terms of like, this is the message of the movie, but it does it in a way that is engaging and entertaining and believable. You believe the character on his journey through this story.
Okay, so I want to go back to Disney films. You mentioned Pixar and how Pixar is great, especially classic Disney films. Maybe we don't, or maybe you do want to opine on contemporary Disney films as well. What's your take on the classic Disney library generally? Is it mostly a lot of bad lessons for our kids in terms of relationships, or is there something to value there?
I think if you look at sort of the Disney princess movies, the classic Disney princess movies, every single one has good lessons that can be drawn. Sometimes you got to dig for them. But if you look at the Disney classic library as a whole, not just the princess films, I think by and large, there's a reason they're classics.
Yeah.
They're great stories, well told with interesting characters, and you can draw a lot of good lessons. You can draw a lot of bad lessons as well, like don't do that. Mm-hmm. But it's all, for the most part, I find that there's a reason they're classics.
Yeah, and I think it comes again to critical thinking, teaching kids. Because we put kids in front of Disney films and we're like, done. Go Disney.
I did it. I parented.
Just because the content is clean.
Because the content is clean. And that's the issue with, the faith subculture that I grew up in, is it's very focused on making sure what's not in it, that these things are absent instead of what's present.
Right.
And I think, and this is something, again, that I think Angel Studios does fairly well, is, okay, we're going to make something that the family can enjoy, but we're also not just going to make cotton candy, right? We're not going to make fluff. And so when it comes to Disney, it's kind of like, okay, the classics have ideas and pretty blatant racism and some other things that you look at today and it's like, we're in a different place.
This did not age well, yeah.
But, and the thing about this didn't age well is I love to look at it like, look at how far we've come. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's an opportunity to have a conversation. And so you look at Peter Pan, what makes the red man red? Not great, but also Peter Pan's wonderful. Right. And I think we can exist in a world where art and artists and people have ideas or concepts that we disagree with, and we still gain value from their perspectives and from their creation. I don't think we have to say, this has that in it, so I'm going to throw the whole thing out. I think we can say, well, I'll look at that critically and say, yeah, this is not something I attach to and here's why, but look at all of this, and that's powerful. And that's kind of the opposite of what I was raised. I was raised with, well, if it's got a swear word in it, that's like a cockroach in an ice cream sundae, and you just got to throw the whole thing out. And I'm like,
it's still 98% ice cream. I really like ice cream. I'm just going to think about that cockroach.
I never thought that metaphor holds up very well with art and stories and things like that.
So good can be gleaned from, like we're saying, almost anything, I'm curious, in your practice, have you ever come across someone, or do you know anyone personally, who it seems like what they take in is always the wrong thing? Like either, like their expectation in life is always based in like some Hollywood fantasy, and your job is to say, no, Hollywood has done you wrong by this messaging that you've received.
Stephanie, I'm feeling really called out right now.
Yeah, I know somebody. You can't control what people take from it, There are a lot of people who are saying, well, I don't want the X-Men because the X-Men are too woke now. And it's like, well, the X-Men were always about standing against prejudice and bigotry. Like that is the through line of the X-Men. Yeah, sure. And so you have people who are not taking the message that was intended. But that is, again, art interacts with the consumer. Right? And it's the same thing, not just art, but people. I can get up and I can give a talk in my church and I can say, this is the intention that I'm putting this out there with, but then it meets the listener. And the listener may take it through a completely different filter. And there have been many times on our show where, because we're dealing with people who have endured trauma, we're dealing with people who have endured prejudice in our fan base, we're dealing with people who have been misjudged and mislabeled, misunderstood, and hated. And we may say something not even thinking of how that's going to land with this person, that person, or the other person, that it was never intended to be hurtful. And when we get that feedback, we could say, well, you took that the wrong way.
And try to blame them.
Or we could say, oh, well, let's meet where we can say, honestly, that was not our intent, but we see that we did that and we want to make the change, right? And that happens in therapy. If I try something in therapy and it completely backfires, I have to recognize, okay, that is part where they're coming from. That's also part me misreading what approach was going to work here. And I think art is a similar thing.
It is 100% similar, yeah.
But you can't go back and change the film, or you could, but people don't.
George Lucas has.
Not to his benefit.
Everything. So much better now.
So
Sorry for hurting you both with that.
no, it's thanks for bringing up a sore subject. But I mean, I guess that this reopens the question, though. How responsible is the filmmaker? Because we've said that look, the audience is responsible for what they take from it, but then we're saying, are they really? And when is the filmmaker responsible if they are?
In my view, filmmaking is not a dialogue. It's a monologue. It is a filmmaker telling a story.
Right.
And it is being told to a person.
I think
the way the viewer receives that is going to vary viewer to viewer.
Right.
But it is, I do not believe it is my responsibility as a filmmaker to change my monologue for every single individual person in the audience.
Yeah.
Because I'm telling the story that I want to tell.
And then when it comes to other things like Oliver Stone, I never saw Natural Born Killers, but Oliver Stone makes this movie Natural Born Killers about serial killers on a killing spree, and people took that and actually acted out violently. And his intent was to criticize our obsession with violence and violent people. It was never meant to glamorize. It was meant to point a finger at the people who glamorize it. You can never 100% tell what somebody is going to do with your art or how they're going to respond to it.
How often do you find a film, like a single film, that really changes a person's mind, heart, or behavior? Or is it more typically, and if there are other examples of that, maybe Natural Born Killers or others, for better or for worse, is it more the diet, like a consistent diet of a kind of messaging or a kind of film that changes us?
Oh, I don't know if either of us are qualified to answer that.
No.
I will say that in my anecdotal experience, every movie that I know of that has gotten sort of a major release, so it's been seen by millions of people, every single movie has had a dramatic impact on somebody. And that is a responsibility as a filmmaker that I take very, very seriously. Anytime I'm making something that I know is going to be seen by more than 12 people, I think very hard about what I'm putting into this, because it is going to affect someone.
Yeah.
The sort of pithy version of that is every movie is somebody's favorite movie.
Well, psychologically, we change more through the steady diet, through the repetition, through the small things that happen day after day after day after day after day, for good or bad. Bruce Wayne, Batman Begins, people need dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy.
Sure.
And so it is true, just like in life, something major can happen that really gets you thinking and re-examining and wanting to make changes. But oftentimes, it's the pileup of the small things that you don't notice until you can't ignore it anymore. And I think that's the same way with the diet of what we consume in media. I think Schindler's List, for example, has the power to be, you could go into that movie and come out 3 hours later radically
A
changed.
very different person.
But by and large, it's going to be slow and steady.
So I'm curious, Alan, what do you feel like, and as a patient, right? What do you feel like you get in therapy that you can't get from film? And maybe a related question, as you watch and you are trying to analyze these relationships or the behaviors of people, do you ever find yourself going, gosh, I wish I could ask them some questions about their experience, that kind of thing?
Sure. What I get from therapy that I can't get from film is discussions specifically about me with a person who has training and, in her case, 2 decades of experience working with people, understanding psychology, and and helping people through problems that are not the same as mine, but similar. And that's what I love about therapy so much, is the ability to, it's cheat codes for mental development is all it is. I'm just skipping level 7 and I'm going right to level 8.
Right.
It's going down the right tube in Mario.
It's exactly what it is. Yeah. No, I go through the little underground thing, then I pop up and you got it.
Yeah. Okay.
You know the reference.
Do I wish I could ask characters questions on screen that I'm watching, or guide them through things? Is that the
Or
Yeah.
wish that maybe their experience was portrayed a little bit differently, addressed slightly, like, oh, this could be so good if they only had
Yeah.
said
we
this or done
constantly-
that or shown
Yeah.
that scene that maybe they cut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More that. Less. I'll tell you why I don't sit there and think I wish I could counsel or ask questions of fictional characters. Because I already do that on the show. So if I'm watching a movie, then I'm usually just watching. The second thing though is, in real life, people say, do you ever see couples like arguing in a restaurant and wish you could just jump in and help? And I always say no. Because
I'm off the clock.
I'm off the clock, number one. Number two, this is very sacred to me. I don't insert myself into the affairs of other people unless I'm invited to.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm just a insufferable know-it-all, in the words of Severus Snape, right? And so it's just kind of, and so I don't do that with real people, much less people who aren't real.
Right.
But definitely I think, and I think probably Alan might think this more because he explores like how would
I
he
am
have
an
done
insufferable know-it-all.
it. Well, you think of how you would do it as a filmmaker, right?
Yes, all the time.
I watch it sometimes and I think, oh, like that could have landed more if they had done it this way, So
And landed more from like the psychological benefit gleaned from this moment could have been stronger.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Because Joel as a filmmaker talks about that. Like if only they had.
Yeah. I do it with not just films, as I'm sure you do also, but anything, books,
Everything, yeah.
ballets, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm constantly criticizing things. I'm an insufferable know-it-all. It's terrible.
Thank you so much, Alan and Jono, for being here and sharing your experience and expertise.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Lightwise is a video podcast production of Angel Studios, released every other Tuesday. To watch more episodes or be notified of new episodes of Lightwise, click subscribe or download the Angel app now, wherever you get your apps. If you'd prefer to listen instead of watch, you can find the Lightwise audio podcast version wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more and to watch light amplifying content for free, go to angel.com. This episode of Lightwise was hosted by Joel Ackerman. It was written and directed by Joel Ackerman, produced by Cameron Jackson and John Shea Van Sickle, and edited by Cameron Jackson, with sound recording by Garrett Briggs and sound mixing by Brian Densley.